used to believe family was forever, that no matter how different we became, love would hold us together. But that belief shattered the night I found out about my sister's engagement party. From a Facebook photo, there she was, glowing in her white dress, surrounded by smiling faces. And not one of them thought to tell me. Not even my own brother. I stared at that picture for a long time, not crying, not yelling, just silent. Because sometimes silence says more than words ever could. I told myself maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they just forgot. But the truth? It was no accident. I was erased in on purpose. And when I finally found out why, I realized something powerful. Sometimes, the only way to get justice is to tell the truth they buried long ago. I still remember the exact moment I saw it. It was a quiet Sunday morning just after breakfast. The house smelled like coffee and toast, and sunlight was sneaking through the blinds, turning everything gold. I sat down in my little corner armchair with my phone, scrolling without much purpose. Recipes, old classmates, a few book club updates. Then without warning, I froze. There it was, a photo so bright, so perfect, that for a second I didn't even recognize the people in it. My sister Laura was standing in the center, beaming. Her fiancé's arm was wrapped around her shoulders, and behind them, dozens of smiling faces. Our cousins, neighbors, even that woman from church who used to borrow Mom's punch bowl every Christmas. Everyone looked beautiful, dressed in their best. The caption read, "The people who matter most." I didn't understand at first. I kept staring, waiting for my name to show up somewhere. Maybe I'd missed a tag or a comment. But it never came. My stomach dropped, and for a few seconds, I just sat there, blinking, thinking maybe it was a joke or an old photo from something else. But no, it was dated yesterday. Yesterday. The same day I'd spent home alone, watching reruns and wondering why no one had called me. I must have read that caption a dozen times. The people who matter most. You'd be surprised how heavy 10 little words can feel. It wasn't anger that came first, it was confusion. Maybe she forgot to send the invite. Maybe it got lost in the mail. Maybe there had been some mistake. But beneath those excuses, a small, cold ache started to take shape. The kind that only grows when something in your heart already knows the truth. Laura and I weren't just sisters. We were each other's only real family after Mom and Dad passed. I helped her move into her first apartment, held her hand when her engagement fell apart 10 years ago, stayed up late editing her grad school essays when she didn't think she was smart enough to finish. I knew her laugh, her fears, her coffee order. I thought I knew everything about her. But that photo told me otherwise. I put my phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The house felt quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears. I tried to think, to make sense of it. Had we argued? No. The last time we'd spoken, she'd called about a new dress she was thinking of buying. She'd even asked for my opinion on fabric colors. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing until now. A part of me wanted to call her right then, just to ask. But I didn't. I sat there instead, the phone heavy in my hand. My mind drifted through years of memories. Thanksgiving dinners, movie nights, little inside jokes that used to make us laugh until we cried. I thought about the time she broke her arm when we were kids, and I stayed up all night beside her bed, reading her stories so she wouldn't be scared. I thought about Mom's funeral, how Laura leaned into me and whispered, "Don't let go." And now, all I could think was, when did she let go of me? I spent the rest of that day in a kind of haze. I did the dishes, folded laundry, and turned on the TV just for noise. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing toward my phone, half expecting a message. Maybe something like, "Helen, I can't believe you weren't there." "You were supposed to come!" But the screen stayed blank. No apology, no explanation, nothing. As the sun began to set, the house filled with that soft, dim light that makes everything look a little lonelier. I sat by the window and watched cars pass by, wondering how long this had been coming. Because things like this don't happen all at once. They build slowly, like cracks in old glass. Silent at first, invisible, until one day, everything just splits. I started to replay little moments I hadn't thought much about before. How she'd stopped calling as often. How her tone had changed, lighter, but with something distant underneath. The way she'd start sentences with, "You wouldn't understand," or how she'd glance at her phone while I talked, her smile polite but distracted. I'd brushed it off back then. People change, I told myself. She's busy. Life moves fast. But now, sitting there with that photo burned into my mind, I realized those weren't small things. They were signs, and I had ignored them because I didn't want to believe they meant anything. When night fell, I finally let myself cry. Not loudly. Just quiet tears. The kind that fall without you even noticing until your cheeks are wet. It wasn't just about missing a party. It was about realizing I'd been fading from her life, inch by inch, while I kept holding on. The next morning I woke up early. I made coffee, though I barely drank it. I looked at my phone again. The same photo, the same smiles, the same caption. Something inside me hardened. Not in a cruel way, but in the way people do when they've been hurt enough times to stop expecting apologies. I decided I needed to know why. Not because I wanted to fight, but because I deserved the truth. I called my brother, Mark. He picked up after the third ring, his voice too cheerful for that early hour. "Hey, Helen," he said. I could hear the sound of dishes in the background, the clatter of silverware, like he was trying to keep busy. "Hey," I said quietly. I saw the pictures from Laura's engagement party. There was a pause. Too long. You can always tell when someone's searching for words they don't want to say. "Oh," he finally replied, his tone careful. "Yeah, it was nice. A lot of people showed up." "I can see that," I said. "I just didn't realize it was happening. I never got an invitation." The silence that followed felt heavier than any answer he could have given. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "Helen, it's complicated. Laura thought, well, she thought it might be awkward." "Awkward?" I repeated, my voice quiet. "Why would it be awkward?" He hesitated again, and that hesitation said everything. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "She didn't think it would be appropriate." I felt my throat tighten. Appropriate. The word echoed in my head like a bell, as if my presence, my love, my history, my entire role as her sister, was somehow inappropriate. I wanted to ask him what that meant, but I didn't. I could hear how uncomfortable he was, how badly he wanted to end the call. So I spared him. "Thanks, Mark," I said softly. That's all I needed to know. When I hung up, I just sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Appropriate. I thought of all the things I'd done for that girl. All the sacrifices I'd made when our parents passed. All the birthdays I'd spent planning for her because she was too busy. And now, apparently I was something to be hidden, but I didn't yell. I didn't call anyone else. I just let the words settle inside me like dust on an old table. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay quiet. That afternoon I went for a walk. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine. Kids rode their bikes past me, their laughter echoing down the street, and I wondered if they'd ever grow up to feel like this, invisible to people they loved. I hoped not. When I came back home, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I saw someone tired, yes, but not broken. My reflection stared back at me. Soft eyes, silver hair pulled neatly back, the faint lines of age that told a story all their own. I thought about Laura again, about that photo, about what it really said. The people who matter most. I realized then that it wasn't just about her forgetting me. It was about her rewriting who I was in her life, and deciding I no longer fit in her picture. But something inside me shifted in that moment. Maybe it was age, or maybe it was grace, but I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt ready to stop trying to belong in places that no longer welcomed me, ready to face whatever truth had pushed me out of that room full of smiling faces. because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about an invitation. It was about something buried, something that had been whispered behind closed doors long before that photo was ever taken. And if they had erased me from their story, then maybe it was time I found out why. I remember the phone feeling heavier than it should have the moment Mark answered. His voice, usually a kind of background hum in family chatter, sounded thin and careful, as if he had practiced the right inflection before picking up. "Hey, Helen," he said, like everything was ordinary, like the sun would come up the same way tomorrow. I told him I'd seen the pictures, not angry, only wanting something simple, an explanation. There was a pause I could feel even through the receiver, like a door hesitating to open. He cleared his throat. "Oh, yeah, it was nice," he said. "What do you mean, nice?" I asked gently. I didn't know about it. "Was it yesterday?" "Yes," he said. There it was, a little crack. Laura wanted a small gathering. It wasn't really a big thing. You know how she is. I did know how she was. I had known since she was a child who braided daisies into her hair and sang off-key with a kind of fearless joy. But I could hear what Mark wasn't saying. "I didn't get an invite," I said. "I know," he murmured. And then, as if the words tasted wrong in his mouth, "Helen, it's complicated. Complicated." That word felt like a soft cloth smothering the truth. My stomach tightened. Complicated how? Another pause. In the silence, I could hear dishes clinking faintly, someone moving in the background, the small human sounds that make up a life. Laura thought it might be awkward, he said finally, the sentence tumbling out like something he'd been trying to catch. "Awkward?" I echoed. "Yes," he said, then a quieter, hesitant, "Appropriate. Appropriate." The word landed in my ear and sat there, precise and small, but somehow heavier than any other word I could imagine, as if I had become a thing that had to be evaluated for social fit, as if my presence could tip a table or unsettle lace napkins. It felt less like an explanation, and more like a verdict. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, watching a small line of sunlight move across the linoleum. The house around me was full of the ordinary proofs of a life lived quietly. A quilt my mother had stitched draped over the back of the sofa, a collection of chipped mugs in the cupboard, the mantel with framed photos of birthdays and holidays. There we were, smiling, younger, no sign of what the future would decide about us. Appropriate for who? I asked, though I knew the answer before the words left my mouth. For what? Mark swallowed audibly. Her fiancé's family. They're well off, Helen. Laura thought. She thought it might be uncomfortable having you there. She worries about their impression. My hands tightened around the phone. For a moment I couldn't feel my fingers. So they invited the rest of the family, I said slowly, but decided I might make them uncomfortable. It wasn't like that, Mark protested. It was about the guests. You know how some people are sensitive to appearances. Appearances, I repeated. The kitchen light above me hummed. I thought of every time I'd ironed a school uniform for Laura when our mother was sick, of every evening I'd sat with her while she fretted over money and men and whether she'd ever be enough. I thought of lessons I'd taught in the library about honesty and worth, the times I'd told kids, what matters is what's inside. It felt like a lecture I'd given to myself, suddenly ringing hollow in my own ears. I'm sorry, Helen, Mark said, the line soft. She said it would be easier this way. Easier for who? I asked. For those who think etiquette outweighs family? For those who think a house price is a better measure of a person than a lifetime of care? He said nothing for a long moment, and in that silence I could feel the space closing around me. I thought of the invitations our mother used to send. Written in clumsy cursive, a smudge of ink where she dipped the pen too quickly, inviting neighbors and friends to a pie or to a church supper. The point of those gatherings had never been shimmer or status. It had been a table and the people around it. Somehow that story had changed for Laura, and I had been left out of the new version. When Mark finally spoke again, his voice sounded small, Look, I didn't want to hurt you. I thought maybe you'd heard something from someone else, or maybe she'd called and you missed it. You thought? I said, not blaming him, only trying to understand. My voice stayed steady, even calm. Years of shelving books and helping shy students present their projects had taught me how to hold a room with quiet. You thought you'd tell me now. I'm sorry, he said again, and the apology felt real but insufficient. He didn't know the half of it. He didn't know how I'd been the one who'd wiped Laura's tears when her heart had been broken the last time, who'd stayed with her through nights that felt endless. He didn't know the tiny ways I had poured myself into our family because no one had shown us otherwise. I let the phone fall gently to my side and sat back in the chair. The kitchen clock ticked in slow, careful time. Outside, a car passed on the street. I could have asked 100 questions then, demanded to know who had decided this and on what grounds. But I didn't. Instead, I let the word appropriate sit between us like a stone in a river. I felt it cool my chest, and then I felt something else begin to grow. A kind of clarity that didn't come from anger, but from a recognition of how the world had rearranged itself. I walked slowly to the mantel and ran my fingers over the picture frames. Mom's sewing smile in one, Dad's crooked grin in another, little Helen and little Laura, arms slung around each other under a tinsel tree. The hand-stitched quilt folded neatly over the sofa bore the years of our family's patchwork, pieces stitched together with effort and love. I had always thought family was an unbroken pattern, but now I could see the frayed edge, the missing patch where someone had cut a shape out and left the rest to hold together. I made tea, the kettle's whistle filling the small space with sound, and poured a cup slow enough to be mindful. The heat warmed my hands, and the steam rose between thought and breath. In the quiet of my kitchen, I considered what this exclusion meant. It wasn't just a party I had missed. It was a decision that redefined how they saw me, as someone who could be sidelined without consequence. Someone who could be rendered with a polite word, inappropriate. Part of me ached in a very old way. I thought of the years when being appropriate meant wearing your Sunday dress to church and hiding your sorrow behind a hymn. I had been raised to keep the peace and to do so with grace. But there was another part of me that had been stewarding a different kind of life, one quiet and steady, made of small acts that mattered over time. That life was not built for parties. It was built for persistence. I called no one else that day. I found I had no appetite for explanations that would come with excuses wrapped in social niceties. Instead, I opened the attic door. I had no plan in mind, only the need to look for something that might anchor me. Climbing the narrow steps felt like stepping back into the past, into boxes of old photographs and the leathery scent of yellowed paper. There was something about the attic that always reminded me of our mother's stories, the way she'd tuck small trinkets away for the future, as if the future were a cabinet you could open and find whatever you needed. The attic was dim and quiet, lit by a single bulb that cast small circles of warm light. I moved through boxes of things, fingers tracing edges, until an old cedar trunk met my hand. The lid creaked as I opened it, and the air that rose smelled like lavender and thyme. Inside were letters tied with twine, a few brittle newspapers, and a brittle stack of envelopes with my mother's looping handwriting across them. My hands moved without thought, pulling each paper up to the light. One letter in particular caught my eye. An envelope addressed not in Mom's hand, but in a hand I did not immediately recognize. It was thin and careful, ink faded by years. When I opened it, the handwriting inside was tender and urgent. There were words about a love that had to be hidden, about promises made late at night under a different sky. I read and felt a strange mixture of curiosity and a creeping, knowing dread. There were dates on the edges of the pages, and a piece of paper folded at the bottom of the trunk caught my eye. It was in my sister's mother's handwriting, and at first I thought it was nothing more than a label. But when I unfolded it, my breath hitched. It was a document, older than the letters, with a name written in the father's column that I didn't recognize. The date was the year before Laura was born. I sat back hard on the trunk lid, the sound echoing in the attic. For a moment the air seemed too thin. The thought that unspooled in my head was not a fully formed accusation. It felt more like a shadow sliding across a room. Could it be? Had someone kept something from me my whole life? I held the paper in my hand as if it might crumble, and for a long while I simply listened to the house breathing around me. On the stairs below, the world went on. Neighbors moved through their days. The mail carrier came and went, small lives carrying the usual ordinary weight. Up here in the cool cedar-scented space, time felt altered. It was as if I had found the hinge on a door that had been painted over for years. I knew then, with a slow, certain clarity, that this was not a simple slight. It wasn't about a dress or an RSVP. It was about a story someone had decided to tell, and a story someone else had decided to hide. And in that hiding, I had been made small. But finding that paper in my hands changed the shape of the hurt. It turned the narrow, personal ache into something wider, a question with sharp edges that needed answers. The attic was cool against my skin, and I felt both the weight of what I'd discovered and a curious lightness at having something real to hold. I folded the document carefully, as if I were handling a fragile thing that could decide the next chapter of our family. I put it into my bag and climbed down the attic steps slowly, the air seeming different each time I crossed the threshold into the kitchen below. At the table, I set the paper beside my tea and sat with my hands folded, waiting for the next move I would make, wondering how long a truth could remain true if no one spoke it aloud. Outside, grapefruit light tinted the day soft and gentle, but inside me there was a new motion. Not the shrinking I'd felt earlier, but a gathering. A quiet, steady gathering of events and pieces that, when put together, might show me why I had been erased from a photograph of people who claimed to be the people who matter most. The attic smelled like dust and cedar and the faint sweetness of mothballs, an old house smell that always made me feel oddly safe. I climbed the narrow steps slowly, the wood creaking under my feet in the way it had for decades, and paused at the little bulb that hung from a frayed cord. The light pooled in a small circle, and the rest of the attic stayed soft and shadowed, like a room remembering itself. I hadn't planned on finding anything when I came up. I only wanted to look at old photographs, to let the past be a warm place for a while instead of a place that pinched. There are afternoons when you need the comfort of history, when the present stings too sharply, and the past, even with its faults, holds you like an old quilt. I ran my hand along boxes tipped with newspaper clippings, boxes tied with string, a hat box with a brittle ribbon, and then my fingers closed on a cedar trunk tucked at the far wall. It was the kind of trunk our mother used to keep, the lid worn in the places her hands had lifted it over and over. When I opened it, a little puff of dust rose up like a sigh. Inside were the things a life leaves, letters tied in twine, a handful of black and white photographs, a stack of birthday cards, and the faint, lovely scent of lavender sachets tucked between the folds. I set the lid aside and sat down on the trunk, the wood cool beneath me, and began to pick through the pile. The letters were the kind you don't see much anymore, handwritten pages with the clean-looped handwriting our mother favored. I read one, then another. They were small conversations through time. A recipe shared, a worry about money, a joke about the neighbor's dog. The handwriting made me feel close to her again, like a hand on the small of my back guiding me up some unseen path. But then there was a letter that wasn't in Mom's hand. The envelope felt different, thinner. The ink faded to a soft gray. The handwriting inside was close and urgent, words folded over themselves, like a person trying to keep something precious from spilling out. It was a love letter, or the kind that reads like one. Shy promises, late-night longing, mentions of meetings under gaslights and the fear of being seen. At first I read it like I might read a story, curious but distant. But there was a date at the top, and the date pressed a little weight into my chest. I kept going, turning pages slowly until a thin, pale document slid out from the back of an envelope, the edges crisp and older than the rest. It was a birth certificate. For a moment I only saw the familiar block letters, the hospital name, the blank places filled in with careful pencil. Then my eyes found the line that named the father. It wasn't our father's name. It wasn't even someone I recognized. My breath stopped like a car that suddenly finds a hill. I sat very still, the attic humming around me. The paper in my hands felt heavier than it had any right to be. I read the name again and again, as if the repetition might smooth the surprise into something ordinary. But the letters remained the same. The date in the margin was the year before Laura was born. My fingers, which had plucked up the paper without thinking, began to tremble. Not from fear, something gentler than that, but from the strange, steady shock that settles into your bones when a truth you never suspected finally comes into light. I thought about little Laura, the child who used to climb into my lap and listen to me read stories, the teenager who leaned on me when she was afraid, the sister who had once kissed away bumps and bruises with the solemnity of a minister. I thought about 1,000 small acts that had been part of our quiet life together. And now I wondered which of those moments had been braided with a secret. The attic felt suddenly narrow. The dusty boxes seemed to lean in closer. The light bulb above my head buzzed as if to warn me. I set the paper down on my knees and ran my thumb along the faded ink until the lines blurred. Questions rose like small, insistent birds inside me. Had Mom known? Had she told our father? Had anyone known and kept silence? I found more papers then. Notes threaded together, dates scribbled on margins, an address written in the ink of someone who had been careful. The letters hinted at a life lived mostly in the dark, at walks by the river and promises that could not be sung in daylight. There were mentions of fear, of rumor, of judgment, and of the impossible hope that time might smooth out the edges of a wound if it was hidden long enough. For a long time I simply sat there, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived under a veil. The attic no longer felt like a place of comfort. It was a small room where the past had decided to show its face. I remembered the tiny ways tension had shown up in our family, the cold corners of conversations, the polite avoidance of certain questions, the way people chose topics like weather or politics instead of that threadbare grief that sometimes hung between us. I had always smoothed those edges, thinking perhaps time or distance had done that. It turned out, perhaps, that smoothing had been someone else's work entirely, an act of forgetting or protecting that had been decided for me, rather than with me. I stood and walked to the little window. Through the grimy glass, the neighborhood lay quiet, the late afternoon light soft and forgiving. The world outside kept going. Children riding bikes, a woman pushing a stroller, the neighbor mowing his lawn like routines could stitch back meaning. Inside the attic, though, everything felt unresolved. There was a particular ache that rose in me, not unlike the feeling you have when you find an old photograph of a self you no longer recognize. This was the realization that our story had a page with writing I'd never read, a sentence cut out and pasted over with a new one that didn't fit. I carried the documents down the ladder carefully, hugging them like a small, fragile animal. In the kitchen, I placed them on the table and made myself more tea, fingers moving by habit while my mind spun with what I had found. I thought about calling Laura right away, but I stopped. I had found a thing that changed the story I'd always known. It felt too raw and important to throw into a conversation that might become defensive or messy. I wanted to see it all, every note, every date, before I let it be a word in someone else's mouth. So I sat and read. I read the letters with the kind of focus you bring to a puzzle you know you can't walk away from. Names repeated, days and places, a pattern like footprints in soft sand. There were references to meetings in towns a few hours from ours, to promises to write, to the fear that someone might discover what was being kept. I could feel the other person, whoever he was, as a real presence in the margins. Steady, urgent, sometimes tender, sometimes worried. The letters painted a portrait of a love that had to hide itself, but the portrait also showed the cost of hiding. It had become a weight that folded into the home, a secret that shifted how people behaved without ever having a voice. As the sun slanted lower and the house filled with the warm hush of late afternoon, the edges of my anger, if it could be called that, softened into sorrow. For my mother, who had kept enough love to make a life, but perhaps not enough courage to claim it openly. For myself, who had loved and been loyal without knowing the whole truth. For Laura, who might be living a life built on a story she hadn't been given, or one she trusted was whole. And yet, through the sorrow and the surprise, something steadied me like a ledger being balanced. The discovery didn't make me less a sister. It didn't erase the thousands of small kindnesses we'd shared. Those things were true whether the ink had another name on a paper or not. But the discovery did change the shape of the narrative around us. It explained, in the quiet way that truths do, the distance I'd sometimes felt, an invisible line between us I had never been able to cross. I folded the birth certificate back into its envelope with a care I hadn't given to many things lately. The attic's quiet felt like a presence beside me, patient and expectant. I didn't know then what I would do with what I'd found. Would I confront? Would I ask questions in a family room with too much glass and too many polite smiles? Would I tuck the papers away and continue to stitch the parts of my life that gave me meaning? The options felt heavy and full of consequence. For now I made notes. I wrote dates and a few phrases on a pad of paper, small anchors to help me remember the ordering of things. I put the letters back into the cedar trunk, but not before slipping a photocopy of the birth certificate into my bag. It seemed right to have something tangible in my hands, not so I could wield it, but so I wouldn't forget how the world had quietly rearranged itself in my family's name. When I finally closed the trunk and climbed down from the attic, the house felt different, as if a room had been breathed into and now required a new kind of tending. I set the kettle on again, as if the ordinary act of boiling water could steady the threads of my day. The steam rose in a soft column, and I breathed in its warmth. Outside, evening settled in slow and sure. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread before me like a map. The map showed an unexpected route through the family I thought I knew. My hands rested on the edges of the documents, not in accusation, but in a kind of careful stewardship. Secrets, I thought, have a way of reshaping the people they touch. They don't always end things. Sometimes they start a new kind of work, the work of understanding, of asking, and perhaps of forgiving. I took the photocopy of the birth certificate and smoothed it with my palm. The letters on the page were still there, small and quiet. I didn't know yet when I would make a move or what words I would use, but I felt a new clarity, not just of mind but of purpose. If there was a story I'd been kept out of, I wanted to read the whole thing, not to punish but to understand. And because understanding, I had learned, often gives you the shape to respond with something truer than hurt. I folded the papers gently and set them into my bag, like seeds waiting for spring. Then I washed my hands, poured another cup of tea, and sat for a while in the dim kitchen light. Outside, the night arrived without drama. Inside, the small lamp cast a warm pool, and I let myself rest in it. I still had questions, and with questions came a plan. I would speak to Mark again. I would take the copies and think. I would wait for a moment when words could be said without breaking everything. For now, there was only the quiet, and a new sense that the family I'd always believed in was not the only story in the room. The week the invitation arrived, it was folded awkwardly into my mailbox like an afterthought. A pale card with gold edging and a penciled note tacked to the bottom. Hope you can make it. L. No ribbon, no phone call, no mention of how sorry she'd been about the mix-up. Just those 4 words in the light, polite curl of a signature. I set the card on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time, the way you look at an old plant you want to save but don't know how. I could have stayed home. I could have let that tiny penciled sentence be a reason to curl deeper into the private life I'd been building, quietly and well. But there's a part of me that still loves the small rituals of family, the shared cake, the ridiculous game someone always thinks is fun, the chance to see faces up close. So I decided to go, not to be included. That wasn't the point, but because I wanted to see them for real. To look at Laura and understand the shape of the life she was making without me. And selfishly, because I wanted to see how it felt to show up when I'd been told I didn't belong. Before I left, I made copies of the papers I'd found. I printed the birth certificate in black and white, the ink a little flattened by the copier. I stacked the letters neatly beside it and tucked them into a folder labeled Memories. as if labeling would make them less dangerous. I didn't plan to use them as evidence, and I didn't want them to be a weapon. I only wanted to hold the truth in my hands, in case the moment came when I needed to make a decision based on facts rather than on hurt. There is a steadiness that comes with paperwork. Names, dates, the sober language of things that can't be winked away. I carried that steadiness with me. The party was held in a bright banquet hall that smelled faintly of lilies and cleaning products, the kind of sanitized cheerfulness that makes real warmth feel manufactured. Streamers crossed the ceiling like careless ribbons. The tablecloths were white, the china pristine, and there were tiers of little pastries that looked too perfect to be eaten. People moved about with plastic champagne flutes and paper plates, laughing like they were following a script. I arrived early, so early that a woman arranging flowers looked up and gave me a smile that was all professional kindness. I nodded back and pinned the invitation card into my coat pocket as if it were a talisman. Inside, the chatter hummed. I saw faces I recognized. Cousins who had always been generous with compliments, neighbors who remembered when our mother used to stand at the church bake sale with a tray of honey cake. I saw Mark in the corner, his smile a little too tight, and I waved to him. He came over, brief and awkward, and gave me a small, earnest hug. "Thanks for coming," he said into my ear. "I know this." He didn't finish, because what was there to finish? A polite hug was the kind of apology that wears easily into the fabric of a day. People asked how I was doing. They touched my arm in the way people touch someone they mean to be kind to. I answered with small things. The garden needs pruning. The book club's reading Dickens next month. My neighbor Mrs. Hall wanted to know if I'd like to join the quilting group. The conversation was light and safe, like skipping stones across shallow water. But beneath the veneer, there was a current I could feel, a subtle shifting when certain names came up. Laura, always central, always praised for her choices. Her fiancé, introduced by his parents as a good catch. A man with steady work and a tidy house. At one point, I wandered near the table of gifts. There were boxes wrapped in glossy paper, a stack of cards tied with a satin ribbon. A woman I hadn't seen in years, Dawn from the PTA, remembered for her bright laugh, touched my sleeve and said, "We missed you at the smaller get-together last week." Her words were soft, but had the tactless edge of someone trying to be kind without knowing how. I nodded and said, "Yes, I heard it was nice." She smiled and moved away. It felt like the party was being displayed in panels. Scenes of celebration, pockets of conversation, glints of older memories like old photographs propped up around the room. When it came time for toasts, they were as polished as the trays. Someone stood and offered a blessing for the couple with a practiced pitch that had the air of tradition more than feeling. Glasses rose and the clink sounded hollow to me, an echo rather than a bell. Laura smiled through it all in the way she smiles when cameras are on her. The sort of smile that sits politely upon the face and keeps the inside private. I watched her carefully, not from jealousy, but from a place of wanting to understand the person she'd become without the history that included me. There was the usual laughter, a little game where people guessed what the couple's future would be like. Someone made a joke about honeymoon destinations, which drew peals of pleasure. The music was gentle and backgrounded, a soft playlist selected for general pleasantness. I sat at a small round table with my tea, feeling the odd sensation of being present in body without being fully seen in the way that matters. People were polite. They were not cruel. The line between exclusion and neglect is a thin one. This felt like neglect, dressed for company. And then, as if the night had been waiting for a new movement, something subtle shifted. Perhaps it was the way someone mentioned family stories in a voice that sounded rehearsed. Perhaps it was the way a cousin told a story with an extra flourish, as if polishing an anecdote so bright it would blind anyone who tried to find the cracks. I felt the old, quiet weight of being the person who had known the most unvarnished versions of those stories. The late-night conversations with our mother. The whispered confessions shared like brittle candy. Those memories were mine. They weren't part of the polished narrative being served to the guests. I had planned nothing dramatic. I hadn't rehearsed a speech or composed a grand pronouncement, but I had come with a folder in my bag, and with the knowledge squashed close to my ribs that sometimes the only kind of justice worth pursuing is the kind that restores truth. I watched a niece open a gift and gush about a woman's magazine article she'd read, and I realized that what the room wanted was a story that fit neatly into a life worth showing off. That's when a steady, soft certainty rose in me. Not anger, not triumph, but that quiet imperative older bodies sometimes inherit. To speak plainly, kindly, and without rancor when the moment finally asks for it. So I stood. It wasn't dramatic. My chair scraped the floor with a sound that surprised a few heads into turning. For a second there was the murmur of curiosity that fans out when someone leaves their seat. I waited, letting the moment settle like a breath held and then released. Laura looked up at me, surprised in a small, genuine way. She didn't yet understand that whatever I was about to say would not be a plea to be included, but an offering of truth. I smiled because the shape of my smile is a gift I give myself, and I began in the only voice I know that stays steady when emotion wants to rush. Quiet, clear, and simply human. "Thank you," I said, and my words were soft but full, for bringing everyone together for Laura. People clapped politely and a few nodded at the right moments. "I'm glad to see so many familiar faces," I continued. "It's been a long time since we had a house full of cousins and neighbors." Then I paused. I felt the room tip toward me like a lens focusing. "I want to tell a small story," I said, and someone laughed softly, thinking it would be a quaint anecdote. "It's about our mother." I did not wait for permission to speak of her. She deserved to be remembered the way she was. Messy, loving, imperfect, and entirely herself. I told them about a winter when the power went out and Mom lit candles and read us a story by the window. I told them about how she braided Laura's hair before school so it wouldn't tangle, and how she used to hide a second slice of cake so the person who needed it most could have it later. The room listened in a way that felt like a small miracle. Eyes softened, shoulders dropped, people leaning in as if memory could be shared and felt together. After those small, tender moments, I moved toward what I had to say gently. "Our family," I said, "has always carried a few quiet things we didn't talk about. Maybe that's because we thought we were protecting one another. Or maybe because the truth felt too sharp." My voice didn't waver. I wasn't seeking to wound. I wanted to clear the air. I found some old letters and a document that made me understand more about our past, about choices our mother made and had to live with quietly. Those things explain a lot of the distance some of us felt, the sighs that came after certain topics, and the way some smiles were a little too careful. I watched faces change in small increments. Surprise, then a blink of confusion, then something like the slow realignment of a picture frame. Laura's hands tightened around her champagne flute. Her fiancé's brow knit, and his smile faltered like a dimmer switch going the other way. A cousin reached for another plate, as if to steady herself. "I don't want to speak ill of anyone," I said, tending the room's fragile balance like a gardener who knows where to prune. "And I don't want this to become a family spectacle. I simply want to be honest. If a story has been told without all of its pages, then it's time we read the whole book. Secrets can protect, yes, but they also have a way of teaching us to live around the missing parts. I think we owe it to ourselves, to our children, to our future, to know the whole picture. That's all." Silence followed my small speech like a respectful tide. It wasn't a silence of guilt so much as a silence of recalibration. People were absorbing a new piece of the map, and the map did not necessarily make the destinations easier to visit. Laura's eyes filled with something I couldn't name at first. Maybe bewilderment, maybe betrayal. And then, very quietly, she whispered my name. I stepped down from my chair when the soft murmur began, and for a moment we stood like two characters who had both learned lines from the same play but had never rehearsed them together. I didn't accuse her. I didn't wield the papers I carried like a club. All I offered was the simple truth that I had found, and the proposal that it was time for us to hold what was true with honest hands. The night moved on eventually. People resumed their towns of conversation. The music returned to its gentle loop, and life began again in the way it always does after a small storm. But something had shifted in that room, a rearrangement of priorities that was subtle and perhaps fragile. I left the shower with my folder still tucked under my arm, lighter by the fact of having spoken, and yet weighted by the knowledge that the next steps would need care. Outside, the evening air felt sharp and clean. My breath came out in small clouds as I buttoned my coat. I had not sought to humiliate anyone. My aim had been simpler, to bring a truth into a place where it could be seen. Whether that would heal anything or bind us anew, I could not know. For now, I let the cold press against my cheeks, and walked home with the quiet certainty that sometimes you have to gather your courage and your facts, and stand at the center of a room, not to be proved right, but to ask that honesty be given a place at the table. For a few seconds after I stopped speaking, no one moved. Not even the air seemed to shift. You could have heard the faint buzz of the ceiling lights or the slow clink of a champagne flute tipping in someone's uncertain hand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wave any papers in the air. I just let the words live in the space the way truth does when it's finally been given a chance to breathe. Laura's smile froze first. It was the kind of smile people wear when they've spent a lifetime practicing composure. But I watched it break. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a quiet falter at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes darted toward her fiancé, and I could see confusion ripple across her face like she was suddenly realizing she'd missed something everyone else had known, but her. I didn't move. I just stood there, hands gently clasped, the way I'd done 1,000 times before in classrooms when a student's lie was unraveling itself without me saying a word. I wasn't there to humiliate her. I wasn't even there to claim a victory. I had come to reclaim something that had been taken from all of us. The right to know where we came from and what love cost our mother. I found the letters, I said softly. My voice was calm, even, but the sound of it seemed to ripple through the room like a stone dropped into water. She kept them in an old cedar box in the attic. Some of them were from before you were born, Laura. They weren't addressed to Dad. A cousin coughed into her napkin. Someone shifted their chair with a screech that made every head turn. But I didn't stop. I'd learned long ago that silence often protects the wrong people. They were written by a man who loved her, I continued, looking at no one and everyone at once. A man who couldn't stay but never stopped writing. I think she loved him too, deeply, quietly. And I think she carried that secret all her life, afraid it would destroy what she built with Dad. The air felt heavy, but my tone stayed gentle. We've all carried that silence one way or another, I said. You, me, Mark. We've lived in a house that never said the word truth out loud. I could feel the sting behind my eyes, but I refused to let the tears fall. I wanted my words to be clean, not blurred. That's why there was always that strange distance, I said. Why some of us felt a little less seen, a little more tolerated than loved. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was just the cost of pretending. Laura's hands were trembling slightly. I noticed because she was still holding her glass. Or maybe holding onto it the way people hold a railing when the ground starts to move beneath them. Her fiancé looked pale, his polite smile gone, replaced by that tight, nervous expression men wear when they realize they've stepped into a story much bigger than the one they rehearsed. I let a breath pass between us all before I continued. I'm not saying this to shame you, Laura, I said quietly, or anyone, but I need you to understand what happened in that attic. What I found, it made sense of everything I couldn't before. The glances, the tone, the feeling of not belonging, even when I was standing right next to you. I took a small step forward, not menacing, just enough that the table between us no longer felt like a barrier. You think I'm hurt because you didn't invite me to your engagement party. And yes, that stung, but it's not about that. It's about the way we've carried lies so long we started mistaking them for love. Mark was watching me from across the room, his mouth set in a tight line. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes. Not anger, not surprise, but recognition. He knew. Or maybe he'd always suspected. The way some truths hum quietly under your ribs your whole life until someone finally says them out loud. A few guests stood awkwardly, whispering to each other. One woman murmured something like, "Oh my God," under her breath. Another shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I could feel the buzz of gossip beginning to vibrate through the air like static, but I kept my eyes on Laura. I didn't want this to become about them. This was between her and me, two women connected by a shared story that neither of us had asked for. "Do you remember?" I said, my voice softening. "When Mom used to tell us that love isn't about being perfect. It's about staying when things are hard." I saw Laura nod slightly, uncertainly, her lips parting but no words coming. Well, she stayed. She stayed for us, for Dad, for the picture she thought she had to protect. But in staying, she erased parts of herself. And in time, that erased parts of us too. I reached into my bag and pulled out one of the letters. I didn't unfold it. I didn't wave it around. I just held it gently between my fingers, the way you hold something fragile. "I'm not here to prove anything," I said. "I'm just here to remind us that what we hide doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits for the day someone has the courage to look it in the face and say, 'I see you now.'" My throat tightened. I took a small breath and said the last part carefully. "The way you set down something delicate so it won't shatter." "You didn't erase me," I said. "You just erased what you never understood." The words left my mouth with the softness of a sigh, but landed with the weight of a lifetime. The sound of them seemed to settle over the room like dust in sunlight. No one clapped. No one gasped. They just sat there, the truth filling the air between us, heavy, quiet, unarguable. I could see Laura's fiancé glance toward the door, as if wondering how long they'd have to stay in this moment before it was polite to leave it behind. Someone poured themselves another glass of wine, just to have something to do with their hands. It's strange how people will do almost anything to avoid stillness when it's charged with something real. I turned, slowly, and placed the letter on the gift table. I didn't look at it again. It wasn't a weapon. It was a peace offering, one they could pick up when they were ready. When I stepped down, the sound of my heels against the wooden floor felt louder than any applause could have been. Each step was measured, not rushed, not dramatic. Behind me, the whispers began, faint, uncertain, like a storm that hadn't decided whether to break or pass. "She's making it up," someone hissed. "I don't think she is," came another voice. "Did you see Laura's face?" I knew there was something about their mother. It went on like that, a hum of speculation, sharp and small and human. I didn't turn around. I walked past the tables, past the golden centerpieces, and the laughter that had turned brittle. As I passed Mark, he reached out and touched my arm lightly. "Helen," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have—" "I should have," I interrupted softly, without anger. "It's been waiting too long." Outside the hall, the air was cool and damp, and the sky had started to bruise into twilight. I stood for a moment on the steps, breathing in the silence that felt more honest than anything that had been said in that room. I could still hear faint murmurs through the door, voices trying to make sense of what had just happened, to fold it into their own versions of the story. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was a kind of strange peace, like a knot I'd carried inside my chest had finally been untied. Not with a yank, but with slow, patient fingers. In my bag, I could still feel the weight of the copies I'd made. The birth certificate folded between the rest of the letters. I hadn't needed to show them. The truth didn't need proof that night. It just needed air. As I walked toward my car, I thought about my mother, about how she must have felt, writing those letters in secret, loving someone she couldn't name, choosing silence over scandal. I didn't blame her anymore. I understood her now in a way I never had before. Sometimes the lie isn't born from cruelty. Sometimes it's born from love. Love that's too complicated to explain, too fragile to survive the world's judgment. But understanding didn't mean accepting the silence. Someone had to break it, or it would keep echoing through the generations. When I reached my car, I looked back at the glowing windows of the hall. Inside, laughter had not yet returned, and I knew. Even if they tried to pretend nothing had happened, the story had changed forever. The next time they looked at me, they would see more than the quiet sister who lived a simple life. They'd see the one who finally named what no one else would. I got in the car and sat for a while before turning the key. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady. The night air smelled of rain, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled softly, the kind that doesn't strike, just rolls across the sky like a warning or a promise. Quiet thunder. That's what my words had been. Not destruction, but sound that lingered long enough to remind everyone it had passed through. And as I drove home, I didn't replay the gasps or the whispers. I replayed only that final sentence, the one that had come from somewhere deeper than pride. You didn't erase me. You just erased what you never understood. Because that, I realized, was what this had always been about. Not revenge, not humiliation, but understanding, and sometimes, the only way to make others understand the cost of silence is to finally stop being silent yourself. The morning after everything unfolded, the world outside my window looked almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for attention but gently insists on being noticed. The first snow of the season had come overnight, soft and slow, covering the yard in a thin white sheet. From where I sat at my kitchen table, I could see how the sunlight caught on each drift, making the whole street look freshly drawn. I wrapped my hands around a cup of tea, feeling its warmth settle into my palms. The house was still, the kind of stillness that follows a long-held breath finally released. I'd half expected to wake up with regret, or with some restless need to explain myself further. But instead, there was only calm. No guilt, no triumph, just peace. It wasn't the loud kind of peace that arrives with applause or validation. It was quieter. Something internal, like my bones had unclenched after years of holding something they were never meant to carry. The truth had been spoken. Not to wound, not to win, but to make room for air where silence had once lived. My phone buzzed on the counter. The sound startled me at first. Then again, the day before had changed the rhythm of things. Even the smallest sounds felt sharper now. I glanced at the screen. There were messages, several of them. One from Mark, short and simple. You did what needed to be done. Another from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in months. I didn't know. I'm sorry. And then there was one from Laura. Just my name. No punctuation, no explanation. Just Helen. I didn't open them. Not yet. For years, I had been the one to smooth over awkward moments, to reach out, to explain away sharp words and broken promises. But that morning, for the first time, I didn't feel the need to respond. Sometimes silence is not avoidance, it's protection. It's giving yourself the grace to breathe before you invite the world back in. So instead of answering, I turned the phone face down, and I reached for my journal. It was an old habit, one I'd carried since my teaching days. Whenever my thoughts got tangled, I wrote. The pen was slower than speech, but it told the truth better. The first words came easily. Truth doesn't destroy families. Secrets do. I paused for a long moment after writing that. The ink glistened for a second before drying. I read it again and realized that in all the years I'd tried to keep peace, I'd mistaken silence for love. I had confused protecting people with protecting lies. But love, real love, doesn't ask you to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. It doesn't survive on half-truths and polite smiles. It survives on honesty. Even when honesty hurts. Outside, a bird landed on the fence, its tiny tracks marking a trail through the fresh snow. It reminded me of something my mother used to say when I was little. Even the smallest things leave a trace. I smiled at that, thinking about her. For the first time, I didn't feel angry at her anymore. I understood. She had done what she could with the tools she had. She had loved us in her quiet, secret way, hoping we'd never have to carry the burden she did. And maybe she was right. Maybe we weren't ready then. But I was ready now. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the warmth from the tea rise into my face. The clock ticked in the background, steady and gentle. Time, I thought, is the one thing that doesn't lie. It keeps moving, no matter who stays behind. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk. The snow had thickened, the sky turning the kind of gray that looks like it's holding its breath. The world felt muffled, as if even the wind was listening. I walked past the houses on my street, the ones with wreaths already hung and candles in the windows. And for the first time in a while, I didn't feel the pinch of comparison. I used to look at those houses and imagine families inside, laughing, together, uncomplicated. But I knew better now. Every family has its unspoken stories, its locked drawers, its attic boxes filled with things too heavy to name. The difference is only whether you choose to keep them hidden or bring them into the light. When I got back home, the answering machine light was blinking. There was a message from Laura. Her voice trembled, though she tried to sound composed. Helen, I don't know where to start. I didn't know about any of it. Mom never told me. I think I was angry at you because you reminded me of her. You still do. I don't know how to fix this, but I'd like to try. I stood there for a while, listening to her words replay in the small kitchen air. For years I had waited for something like that. Acknowledgement, maybe, or a soft edge to the walls we'd built between us. But now that it had come, I didn't feel the rush of relief I'd once imagined. Instead, I felt something gentler, understanding. People don't change all at once. The truth doesn't heal overnight. It lingers, reshapes, asks to be tended like a wound that needs light and air before it can close. So I didn't call her back right away. I let the moment sit, like a seed resting beneath the snow. Some things need time before they can bloom. As the afternoon faded into dusk, I made another cup of tea, my small ritual of peace, and sat by the window again. The snow had deepened, erasing the footprints from earlier, smoothing everything into quiet perfection. It struck me then how forgiving nature can be. It covers what's old, not to hide it, but to let it rest. The folder with the letters still sat on the counter, unopened since that night. I thought about burning them once, but I decided against it. The truth had already done its work. It didn't need to disappear. It only needed to exist. I slipped the papers back into the envelope, tied it neatly, and placed it in the drawer beside my journal. Not as evidence, as history, a reminder that even painful things can belong to peace once they've been faced. That evening, I wrote one last entry. They erased me from their story, but I wrote my own ending, and in mine I'm finally free. I didn't cry when I wrote it. I didn't even feel sadness. What I felt was closure, the kind that doesn't slam doors but quietly turns the lock and walks away. The snow outside caught the glow from the streetlights, scattering it like dust. I thought about how life, for all its noise and sharp edges, always circles back to stillness if you let it. I thought about the younger me, the one who kept trying to be included, to be seen, to be enough. She'd spent a lifetime earning her place in other people's stories. Now, I realized, she had one of her own. When I went to bed that night, the world felt balanced again. Not perfect, just honest, and that was enough. The next morning, when the sun rose over the snow-covered roofs, it painted the sky with soft shades of pink and gold, colors that whispered renewal rather than ending. I smiled at that. There's something beautiful about quiet mornings after storms. The world always looks a little cleaner, a little braver, and maybe that's the lesson I needed to learn all along. That peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the understanding that you survived it, that you walked through it, and that you're still standing. Softer, but stronger. So I turned off my phone, poured myself another cup of tea, and simply sat, letting the warmth of the moment fill the space where bitterness used to live. And if you're listening now, if you've ever been erased from someone's story, made to feel small or forgotten, I hope you remember this. You can always write your own ending, one where you choose truth, one where you choose peace, and one where freedom doesn't have to be loud to be real. If you felt something in this story, if it reminded you of your own, share it. Leave a comment. Let someone else know they're not alone in the quiet work of healing. Because sometimes, the softest voices carry the deepest truths. And this was mine.